everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm in Rio and I have Brian Meir with me here. Brian, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, hello, my name's Brian Meir. I'm a geographer and a writer, and I worked for 10 years in the non-governmental sector in Brazil with projects involving poverty and children in favelas and in rural areas. And altogether, I've lived in Brazil over 20 years.
Yeah.
In fact, I first lived in Brazil from 1991 to 1994, which is about the time that you left.
Yes.
You know, so I've seen a lot of changes since that time, and I feel like in a way you've kind of came from a time capsule from 1991 and arrived in a different Brazil. A lot of things have improved since then, but some things haven't, and some things are now getting a lot worse. In the last year specifically. 5 million people have dropped below the poverty line in Brazil.
And we are going to talk a little bit about that later. But first, can you tell us a little bit more about you? You're from America?
Okay.
Yeah, because
so
you're not Brazilian.
No, I'm not. I'm from Chicago, and I moved to Brazil when I was 22 years old. Because I just decided I wanted to live in another country at that point. You know, I was fed up with the United States, especially at the time in my 22-year-old mind.
Yeah.
I didn't want to live in a country that only had 10 days of holidays per year.
Yeah.
And so I decided to move to Brazil because it had some of the best kind of European style quality of life, like public health service and 30 days of holidays per year, but it had some of the excitement of what I think the new world, you know, it's like more new and vibrant, kind of like, it reminds me in some ways of the best things of the US and some of the worst things from the United States exaggerated, much worse.
So, and then you, it wasn't because of love, so it was because of you wanted to stay in another country that you moved
Exactly,
in.
yeah. I mean, I ended up getting married pretty quickly, but I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, that's what happens when you meet Brazilian women, maybe.
Maybe. I've heard.
Yeah, and you also, if I'm not wrong, you also work as a journalist sometimes.
I work as a journalist. I'm actually a research fellow at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, which is a think tank based out of Washington, D.C., which provides policy analysis of Brazil and political and economic analysis. I do some writing that would be maybe considered more academic writing, and I also do some journalism sometimes, and I also blog for a blog called Brazil Wire.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about the situation in Brazil for the poor people, the homeless. That's something you talk a lot about.
Yeah, actually, when I was a manager at ActionAid, which is a big international charity organization, I was lent out to the Indian Supreme Court for 2 months to conduct a comparative analysis of homeless policies in Brazil and India at that time. And so a lot of positive things happened in homeless policy in the last, since you left Brazil, since you were adopted. For example, the kind of orphanage that you were at back then, that's illegal now. You can't have more than 15 people in an orphanage.
And I think we have to say that the time I left Brazil was 1991. I was adopted in 1991 and I lived at an orphanage for 1 year. But the situation now is totally different.
It's different, and it's funny because I think you must have heard that I was coming because I've looked at the dates. I think you left Brazil 1 week before I moved to Brazil. So
I think it was wise of me. No, just kidding.
But yeah, at that time, for example, they didn't have internet really. None of the government agencies were computerized, and they had a very hard time finding people's families, you know? And also there was no law about how many people you could have in an orphanage. So I know that at your time, you were in an orphanage with about 200 other kids.
200 other kids, and it was more like, to be honest, it was more like, not a prison, but there is another word for it in English, I just can't find it. It's not prison, but
Reform school.
Reform school, yes. A lot of kids put together in different ages, and too few staff. So it gets like really messy, the kids fights a lot, and
well, that's something that they changed, you know, now, for example, for someone to be adopted internationally, the orphanage has to prove that they've taken every possible measure to find the family and to prioritize the family over a foreign adoption. So that's one major change. The other is that now there's a limit of 15 people per orphanage, and there's a minimum number of staff that have to be there.
Yeah.
And so those are positive developments.
Yeah.
But
and when you say that they want to find the kids' families first before making an adoption or doing an adoption, do you mean that if they find someone that is not suitable for the kid, will they leave the kid with that family member, or will they instead make an adoption? Because
No.
I'm thinking of the kid. If you find family members, but maybe the family members don't have the money, or maybe they are having some other problems, and that kind of problems would be good for the child. Do they leave the children with the family then, or do the kids stay at the orphanage and then get adopted?
Well, from what I understand, most of the older kids who are in orphanages today have some contact with their families.
Yeah.
And it's a situation where their families are not deemed capable of taking care of them because often of drugs, alcohol abuse, or poverty.
Yeah.
And in that case, they're very reticent to allow someone to adopt them and take them to a foreign country because they feel that some contact with the family, even if the child is living in an orphanage, is better than no contact.
Yes.
Even though, every situation is different, that might not be the correct call at some point. But, the laws were made in a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's a very complicated situation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
For clearing that up. Thanks. I was thinking about talking a little bit about the homeless people in Brazil, because after I left in 1991, the situation in Brazil got better, much better actually, generally for the people, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, there were significant improvements.
Yes.
In the first decade of the 21st century, 35 million people rose above the poverty line.
Yeah.
Although now in the last year, 5 million have sunk down below, but it's still better off than it was when you were living here.
Yes, but like you said, 5 million has dropped below, so something is happening in this country. Something is happening. We can see more homeless people, more homeless children. Can you tell us a little bit about your view of the situation? What is happening to the country that makes it more people falling below the poverty line?
Well, I'll try to make this short and clear. Brazil had a military dictatorship for about 21 years, from 1964 to 1985, and they followed kind of developmentalist policies, Keynesian kind of policies, and as a result of a lot of corruption and graft, there was a huge inflation crisis, and there was a couple of successive presidents that implemented austerity as a form to stabilize the economy. These austerity programs cause homelessness to increase incredibly,
Yeah.
Starting in the late 1990s, with some of the things done in Fernando Henrique Cardoso's presidency, they started taking measures to build a kind of European-style social welfare state in Brazil. And so under Fernando Henrique Cardoso, when he took office, only 60% of the Brazilian children were actually in school. They didn't even have universal education. By the time he left office, they'd taken measures to really increase the number of kids in school and provide enough space in schools for kids to enter. And then when Lula was elected, they kept pushing it farther forward to the point where 98% of the kids were in school. And part of the Lula government was based on maintaining macroeconomic stability, dealing with the big international banks, not doing anything to scare off the business community, but they also made large increases in minimum salary, and they created a welfare system called Bolsa Familia, where parents of children are paid if they can guarantee that their children are in school with good attendance records and that they go to regular medical checkups. They get a certain amount of money a month.
Yeah.
So the minimum wage increases and this Bolsa Familia program together made a big impact on poverty.
Yeah, can I just ask one thing here? Because the Bolsa Familia was because parents were not letting their children go to school either, because the children could work and that way they could get the money. Is that one of the reasons?
Yeah, exactly.
The poor people did that, let the kids.
There were really two reasons. One, there wasn't enough schools. You know, they didn't, like the military dictatorship did not guarantee universal right to education. So there just weren't enough schools and there weren't enough teachers qualified to teach. So that was one problem. Another problem was that poor children, their parents would send them to work to drop out of school. And this is something very historic in Brazil. You have songs about people talking about how they had to leave school in 3rd grade to sell candy and things like that. And so they did a big study and they found out how much the average kid was earning selling candy on the street and gum. And they made that the value from Bolsa Familia. So basically, it was like if he could leave school and work, or he could stay, you could get the same amount of money if he stayed in school. And so this brought the school population up a lot, to 98%, to near universal levels. And the minimum wage in real terms, against controlled for inflation, doubled. So these things, two things together, are cited as the two factors that lowered poverty the most in Brazil. At the same time, they implemented a lot of homeless policies, of innovative. What they found was that there was a lot of good programs and laws in place for the homeless, but the average homeless person just had no idea that they could access any government services. So they started sending, this was during the Dilma Rousseff administration, they started sending social workers out onto the street to talk to homeless people, you know?
So you could say that one of the problems is that because you don't have education, you do not know what kind of rights you have. And when you don't know your rights, you don't know that you can get help.
Yeah, exactly. Brazil is like, it's not a poor country if you compare all the countries in the world. You know, it's a middle-income country, and it has good
natural resources. This country, it's like one of the richest country in the world, actually.
A lot of it's probably the 9th richest country in the world right now. So what happened is you had a lot of good laws and policies in place, with a lot of local governments that just ignore the laws and ignore the policies, and a lot of poor people who didn't understand what their rights were. And so during the Dilma Rousseff administration, her first term in office, she implemented a program called Brazil Without Misery, which was intended specifically to search out for the poorest of the poor and get them involved in the programs that were available to them. And at one point, it looked like extreme poverty was going to be completely eliminated. At least that's what the UN said in 2012.
Because a lot of organizations moved out from Brazil, moved out from Brazil. Is that correct?
Most of the big donor nations like USAID, SIDA from Canada, SIDA from Sweden, DFID from England, World Bank, Inter-American Bank, they stopped donating money to the charity sector in Brazil because there was a common consensus around 2011, 2012 that extreme poverty was going to be eliminated. But what's happened since? There's been a regime change. A lot of people call it a coup, a parliamentary coup.
Towards Dilma.
Against Dilma, who was the first woman president. There was a lot of sexism involved, and she was very unpopular.
Can we pause here a little bit and just talk? Can we talk a little bit about? She was the first woman president, and like you said, she was very unpopular.
She was popular at first, and then she started realizing that there was a kind of coup attempt underway, and so she embraced the policies of the conservatives, or the, I guess you would call liberal or neoliberal economists. And she started removing some of the social benefits that had been gained in the previous 12 years. And so she lost popularity from everybody who would consider progressive or leftist, and the people on the right all hated her anyway. So at one point, her popularity was like 10%. And so she was, but it's come out that she didn't commit any crimes subsequently. So she was impeached more because of like her opposition sensed a moment of weakness because she was doing bad in the polls, but there was no legal justification for impeachment. And the austerity reforms that she was beginning to implement were very mild compared to what's happened since her successor, Michel Temer, has taken office. He, for example, passed a constitutional amendment freezing education and health spending at below inflation levels for the next 20 years. He's lowering the minimum salary next year. He's basically changed the labor laws to the point where it's now almost legal perfectly legal to own a slave in Brazil.
Yeah. Can you tell a little bit about that? I mean, how is it possible to almost own a slave in Brazil?
Okay.
You know, you have to be a little bit more.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well, there's a long history. Brazil, basically, the power structure in Brazil, the people who've been running the country for 500 years are the large landowners. They had slavery until 1889. Brazil was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. Land was only passed hereditarily until 1850. The Portuguese set up kind of feudal system where the captains would receive land grants and they'd pass the land to their children. In 1850, they legalized selling land.
Yeah.
And at this point, anyone with money bought land or stole land, you know?
Yeah.
And slavery was only legalized in 1889. When the slaves were freed, there wasn't that much land left to go around, and they didn't have any financial condition to buy land.
Yeah.
So there's a huge section of the country that's never had the benefit of getting land.
Yeah.
And there's about a couple hundred families that are descendants from these original Portuguese barons and dukes and things like that control huge amounts of land.
Yeah, because I heard like that there are persons people here in Brazil that own families that own like land that is the size of Sweden.
Yeah,
the Amazons and everything.
3% of the population of Brazil owns 2/3 of the land.
Yeah.
3% of the population.
And then we have to say that in Brazil it lives like around 200 million,
200 million people yeah.
above 200 million.
But own is a vague term because a lot of this land was stolen.
Yeah.
And getting back to the slavery point of view, a lot of times these guys would they'd purchase legally 10 hectares of land, and then they'd come in with their gunmen as late as the 1960s and 70s, and even now in places like Pará, where they're ripping down the Amazon, they come in with their gunmen and fence off like 10,000 hectares of land.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they tell the people who are already living there, like, you work for me now. Yeah. And there's a serious problem. Until the late 1990s, you could still read about it in textbooks in Brazil, of these large plantations where the people who worked on the plantation were paid in vouchers that they could only purchase products from the company, the owner's stores at very inflated prices. Yeah. And they had armed security that would try and kill anyone who tried to escape or stop working. Yeah. And so that's a situation analogous to slavery. Yeah. And the changes in the labor laws have made it almost impossible to punish someone for doing that now. Yeah. And so there was a study.
But is this something that happens today? Because you said this was up until 1990s.
No, it's still happening.
It's still happening.
With the voucher system, I don't have the numbers, but I do know that Congressman Domingos Dutra in Maranhão State, which is a state with a lot of former Amazon jungle in it, commissioned a study with a human rights group 3 years ago that showed that there's still 10,000 people in Maranhão working in slave-like conditions. Yeah. And so the new labor law has wiped that off. You know, the new labor law has made it much more difficult to punish people for treating workers in slave-like conditions.
But going back to the homeless people, you've been working with an organization, or is it just you? How? Because you work with the homeless people, you help them. Yeah.
Well, I work with the housing movements.
The housing movement, yes.
And most of the people who are in the housing movements, they entered these social movements to try and gain the right to public housing because they were homeless. Yeah. You know, so a lot of formerly homeless people are living in social housing now because of the work done by these housing movements. There's specific homeless organizations as well. There's a movement of one of the biggest groups of homeless people in São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, for example. They're the garbage scavengers. They have these kind of cars that they pull, and they pick recyclables out of garbage. And many of them sleep on the street under their carts, you know, and they can't afford to pay rent in the areas where they work because most of the garbage is generated downtown. And if they were to build their own house in a favela far on the outskirts of town, in the cheapest favelas, you know, they don't make enough money to get there and back every day. So some of them sleep on the streets during the week, and on the weekends they try to go back to visit their family or something like that. But a lot of them just stay near their carts all the time. And this represents about 2/3 of the homeless people in Sao Paulo. Another big group are drug, chemical dependents. But the largest group are people who actually work. And just because they don't have access to housing, they sleep on the street. And they're organized, they have a union, you know, and they for 10 years in a row, they had a Christmas dinner with the president every year, and they've pushed through some legislation to facilitate finding cheaper housing in downtown areas. But it's a struggle. And so a lot of, basically, the two biggest housing problems in Brazil are favelas and homeless, you know? There's a lot more people living in favelas than there are homeless people, but the root cause is pretty much the same thing. It's that when they started cutting down a lot of forest in the Northeast, and when there were these droughts, these huge droughts in the 50s and 60s, there was this massive wave of migration from the Northeast and from parts of Minas Gerais too, where suddenly, like in 1950, Sao Paulo's population was 1.2 million. By 2000, its population was 11 million. And so you see in the city itself, Greater Sao Paulo now has 24 million. Okay, but basically you saw cities like Rio and Sao Paulo, you saw their population increase 4 times, 5 times, 6 times over in a period of 40 or 50 years. And the government was not able to keep up with that amount of growth in the cities. And so people were forced to either live on the street or build their own houses, in a lot of times in precarious areas of mudslide danger, flooding danger. And this is how the favelas popped up.